On the first Sunday nights of the month, we study about evidences. And we've studied about evidences for God, evidences for the Scriptures, and why we can trust them. And right now, what we're trying to focus on with this evidences series is studying about Jesus, evidences for Jesus. A couple of months ago, we focused on the historical evidence that exists for Jesus Christ. Well, we can trust that he was indeed a real historical character. And once we establish that, we start building on that and considering some of the other evidences for Jesus. If he was real, then what do you think about other areas of the life of Jesus that we're forced to consider as we try to grapple with who he is? Was he just a real historical character? Was he just a good moral teacher? Was he the Son of God? And I think a strong evidence for Jesus Christ being the Son of God is his miracle-working power. And so I want to think about that with you here tonight. In order to believe that Jesus is the Son of God, then we need evidence. And so I don't fault anyone who wants more evidence. I think that's good that you want evidence. You want to make a decision about Jesus with evidence. You want proof that he is who he is. And I think we want evidence that he's unique. We want evidence that he's different. We want evidence that he is supernatural. And God didn't leave us without evidence. God didn't leave us without proof, so that our faith can have a solid foundation upon which to believe. And so one of those areas is the realm of miracles. The miracles of Jesus enable him to stand above the pack. They were written down by eyewitnesses centuries ago who died for their testimony, and they provide us with a reason to believe. Now, miracles are not the only area of evidence. There's other areas of evidence that we will consider, but they were recorded to provide evidence to back up the claims of Jesus. Perhaps one of the passages that you might be familiar with is John chapter 20. I'm sure many of you are familiar with that. But in John chapter 20, John says that he recorded the signs that he recorded in his gospel. He says, "These are written so that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that believing you may have life in his name." He says, "I've written down these signs, these miracles, because I want you to believe in who Jesus claims to be and who the authors of those Gospels assert him to be." So as we think about miracles, I want to start out by thinking about what the definition of a miracle is, because that's a word that I've thrown around a lot in our Luke series. It's a word that we use a lot. We don't always take time because we assume everybody understands what a miracle is, but not everybody understands what a miracle is. Sometimes the word miracle is misused. It's not really used in the biblical sense of the word, and so I want to take a few moments to define miracles. A good definition of miracles, I think, a clear definition, is from C.S. Lewis's book titled Miracles. On page 75, he says, "In calling them miracles, we do not mean that they are contradictions or outrages. We mean that, left to her own resources, she," and he's referring to nature when he says she, "nature could never produce them." So when we're talking about miracles, we're talking about something that you cannot see naturally occurring. Go on and take another definition if you don't want to just read C.S. Lewis. William Taylor writes a book called The Miracles of Our Savior. There's some good points in this book. And he says, "We understand a miracle to be a work out of the usual sequence of secondary causes and effects, which is produced by the agency of God through the instrumentality of one who claims to be his representative, and in attestation of the message which as such he brings." Okay, you can probably think of some examples of miracles in your Bible, right? You can think of Moses putting his hand into his cloak, pulling it out, and it's leprous, and then putting it back in. That's just not something that happens naturally. Or taking the rod and throwing it down, it turns into a snake, and picking it back up, and it turns back into a rod. This is something that is produced by the agency of God. God is the one who caused that to happen. but he is using Moses as an instrument, Moses as his representative to perform this miracle. Take a look at another definition. We'll look at an actual dictionary, Bible dictionary. Dunamis, that's where we get our word dynamite from, but that's the Greek word that sometimes is translated miracle. It's dunamis, which is where we get dynamite. Dynamite's power. And that's the idea behind a miracle. There's something powerful. And so it's defined as force. Specifically, Strong's Dictionary of Bible Words says it is miraculous power, usually by implication a miracle itself. And there's a lot of sub-definitions to go along with that, but I think that makes the point. Vine's Complete Expository Dictionary of Old and New Testament Words. By the way, when we try to define Bible words, we don't just use the Merriam-Webster dictionary or anything like that. Use an actual Greek dictionary. It tells you what the word meant in Greek in the first century. And so that's why we use things like Strong's or Vine's to define it. But it defines it as power or inherent ability. It's used of works of a supernatural origin and character such as could not be produced by natural agents and means. Do we get the idea of what a miracle is? Miracle is supernatural. It's something that does not happen in nature. It is supernatural. It's something that God does and often does through his representative, an instrument. So when we speak of miracles, we're referring to acts which can only be credited to supernatural power, to God. But think about it this way. When we talk about cars, we sometimes think of cars in terms of horsepower, right? How much horsepower does it have? When we think of work, when we think of a job that needs to be done, we think of it in terms of how much manpower do we need to accomplish this job in our work. When we think of miracles, we are thinking of an act which can only be attributed to God power. We're talking about God power when we're thinking about miracles. Now, even though this is what miracles, the definition of miracles are, I think it's probably pretty obvious to most. There are a lot of people who deny the existence of miracles, the reality of miracles. So when you believe in the supernatural power of the miraculous one, you automatically will begin to find resistance from those with a naturalistic worldview. So if you've been brought up in public schools, if you've been brought up in public universities, the majority of public schools today and public universities teach their sciences from a naturalistic worldview. In other words, they do not believe, they do not teach the supernatural impact of God upon events. Everything has to be explained naturally. And so, when that's what you've been brought up to believe, is there is no supernatural, there is no God, then you are going to enter into the study of miracles automatically with an anti-supernaturalistic bias. Okay? That's a big word. But you're going to have an anti-supernaturalistic bias. Why? Because if you've been taught this without influence from the church or Christians or religious faith or anyone with the idea that there could be supernatural forces that exist in this world or have existed, then you are led to believe that there is no such thing as supernatural influences, and so you have an anti-supernaturalistic bias. Dare I say, you have been brainwashed to believe there is no supernatural. And I don't really have a problem using the word brainwash because that's what they accuse us of believing. Brainwashing works both ways, all right? Now, that's one of the reasons why there are people who do not believe in miracles, because they have a priori assumptions of anti-supernaturalism. We also see that in the scriptures, the people who didn't like Jesus and didn't want to submit to his lordship, didn't want to admit that he was the Son of God because he was a threat to their power, he was a threat to their popularity. They had an anti-Jesus bias, and that's why they try to discredit the miracles of Jesus. But the purpose of miracles is to convince us and to persuade those with these objections that there is a God who can and has worked in times past. However, historically, the opponents to Christ and his apostles objected to his miracles in various ways. I want you to think about how they objected. When you actually read the scriptures and you think about the people who didn't want to admit the miraculous power of Jesus, and most specifically who Jesus was, you'll notice that they never actually deny that the miracle occurred. What they do is they try to explain the miracle as something else, or they ignore the miracle completely and they attack the messenger. And let me give you some examples of that in Matthew chapter 12 and verse 24. Matthew 12, verse 24, it says, when the Pharisees heard it, they had heard that Jesus had cast out a demon, they said this fellow does not cast out demons except by Beelzebub. Hold on a minute. Do you know what they just did when they made that statement? They admitted Jesus cast out demons, but they said he doesn't do it by the power of God, though. He doesn't do it by his own innate power. He doesn't do it by the power of the Spirit. In order for them to explain, well, how has this obvious miracle occurred? They say, well, he did it by the power of Beelzebub, the ruler of the demons. And Jesus goes on to explain why that's not really logical. Why would the ruler of the demons want to cast out demons? I mean, the demons are on his team. Why does he want to kick his team off the team? So you're going to have to come up with a better explanation than that. Take a look at another passage, John 9, 16 through 18. It says, therefore, some of the Pharisees said, this man is not from God. So he's just performed a very obvious miracle in John chapter 9. There was a man that was blind. The text says that he is born blind. He'd been blind his whole life. Everybody knew he'd been blind his whole life. And all of a sudden he's seen. And in order to try and discredit Jesus, they don't deny that the blind man now sees. Do you notice that in John 9 when you read the text? They admit that he sees. But they say this man can't be from God because he does not keep the Sabbath. They try to discredit Jesus because, well, clearly he probably hasn't really done this because he did it on the Sabbath day. And then others ask a very logical question. They kind of make the argument that we would make, right? Well, how can a man who is a sinner do such signs? Then how do you explain what's just happened? So there was a division among them. So they deny the miracles, not necessarily the miracle, but they deny and discredit Jesus by what they say about him. Look at Matthew 13, 54 through 56. When he had come to his own country, he taught them in their synagogue. They were astonished. So here he is, he's in his hometown. And they said, where did this man get this wisdom and these mighty works? Do you notice by their question that they admit Jesus was performing mighty works? He was performing miracles. But notice how they try to discredit Jesus. Is this not the carpenter's son? No, that's Joseph's son. He's just the guy that works in the wood shop. He certainly can't be performing miracles. Is not his mother called Mary? She's just a poor girl from Nazareth. So this can't be Jesus. They try to discredit him by bringing up, he's not of the high enough social class to be performing these miracles. But they've just admitted he performed the miracles. His brothers are James, Joseph, Simon, Judas. Where did this man get all these things? Try to discredit him. Take a look at Acts 26, 23, and 24. Okay, Paul is preaching, and he's preaching specifically about the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus. Paul is explaining why he has converted to Jesus Christ. It's because of the death, burial, and resurrection, because of a miracle. Because there's a really awesome miracle that Jesus performed, and Paul says, I really can't wrap my head around it, and since I can't wrap my head around it, and it's true, then I became a believer in Jesus too. And he's explaining this to Festus, and Festus says with a loud voice, Paul, you are beside yourself. Much learning is driving you mad. He can't argue against the resurrection. People don't have good arguments against the resurrection, really. When you start actually asking questions and getting into the subject matter of the resurrection, that miracle, there are not a lot of really great arguments. There are accusations. There are people yelling really loud. There are people calling you names. You see that so often when you try to have a civil discussion, it turns into name calling. You're just a crazy person. You Christians are just a bunch of idiots. That's not an argument. That's an attack upon the messenger. It is not dealing with the actual message. But that's how they dealt with Paul. That's how they're going to deal with us from time to time. He doesn't deny the resurrection. He doesn't have good arguments against the resurrection. So historically, there were these kinds of responses to the miracles of Jesus and the miracles that were brought up by the apostles. Maybe some of you have seen this movie. I don't necessarily recommend it, but dodgeball, right? I think sometimes we need to quit playing spiritual dodgeball with the truth. We are dodging the issue. We are ducking, we're dipping, we're diving. Jesus and apostles, the only responses people had to the miracles were they were derided, they were discredited, they were devalued, but historically, their critics rarely denied the miraculous acts. They could not deny that something incredible had happened. And we need to make sure that we're not in the position of the dodgeball guy. We're just denying the reality by coming up with all kinds of excuses. So, because they really couldn't deny what had happened, then you see language like this in the sermons of the apostles. For example, Peter in Acts 2:22 and 23 says, "Men of Israel, hear these words, Jesus of Nazareth, a man attested by God to you by," how? "Miracles, wonders, and signs, which God did through him in your midst." And he goes on to really kind of rub it in, "as you yourselves also know." You know you saw the miracles. You heard about the miracles. Can't really deny the reality of the miracles. You know these things happen. And he says that to let them know that this is a piece of evidence and they need to deal with it honestly. Where does the evidence lead? They need to deal with it honestly. You see something similar in Acts 4:15 through 17. The council conferred among themselves, saying, "What shall we do to these men?" And the council, where this miracle has just been performed, this is the healing of the lame man in Acts 3 that they're referring back to. They say, "What shall we do to these men?" And they're talking about Peter and the apostles. "For indeed a notable miracle has been done through them, and that's evident to all who dwell in Jerusalem." Again, they don't deny something awesome has happened here, but we need to shut it up. Because if we don't, people are going to become Christians. And we don't want that to happen because that's an attack upon our power. So he says, a notable miracle has been done. We cannot deny it, but so that it spreads no further among the people, let us severely threaten them. Let's tell them, we're the Sanhedrin. We're in power here among the Jews, and we want you guys to be quiet. And so they said, we're going to tell them, you shouldn't speak about Jesus Christ anymore. That doesn't work. But it's what they try to do. They try to bully them into submission. In Acts 4:15 and 16, their response here, I think I have, I've definitely got the wrong passage here cited. Let me see. Try to get you the right one. Anyway, the king, this is Paul preaching again, I think this time to Agrippa, obviously. "The king before whom I also speak freely, he knows these things. I am convinced that none of these things has escaped his attention." This thing was not done in a corner. The miracles of Jesus, the miracles of his apostles, they were done openly. People could see them. People witnessed them. They did that on purpose. And Paul says, you need to deal honestly with the miracles that have been done, with the resurrection of Jesus that everybody is talking about. So he says, "King Agrippa, do you believe the prophets? I know that you do believe." And Agrippa said to Paul, "You almost persuade me to become a Christian." I think Agrippa knew that Paul had a pretty good argument there, but Agrippa just wasn't ready to make that decision. He had some selfish motives. And then one more. This is something that we've studied recently from the Luke text, but this is the Matthew text. "When John had heard in prison about the works of Christ, he sent 2 of his disciples and said to him, 'Are you the coming one, or do we look for another?' And Jesus answered and said to them, 'Go and tell John the things which you hear and see.'" I like that Jesus says, "Go and tell John the things that you hear and that you see." He doesn't say, "Go and tell John that I've done a few miracles privately. I'm the only one who witnessed it. I'm the only one who knows about it. But go ahead and tell him what I told you." Jesus says, he performs miracles, first of all, in front of them, and he says, just go back and tell them what you saw. You're eyewitnesses to miracles. And you being eyewitnesses to miracles, you can let John know that he's not in prison suffering for no purpose and no reason. He's suffering for the Christ. And so he says, go and tell them what you hear and see. The blind see, the lame walk, the lepers are cleansed, the deaf hear, the dead are raised up, and the poor have the gospel preached to them. And yet, there are some who deny the miracles. One more passage, and then we're going to get into another point here. But when Nicodemus came to Jesus, one of the things that he said to Jesus, he being a ruler of the Jews, he comes to Jesus by night, and he says to him, Rabbi, we know that you are a teacher come from God, for no one can do these signs unless God is with him. Nicodemus was pretty honest about where the miracles led. Jesus, I know there's got to be something unique about you. You must be a representative of God. He doesn't come to grips with him being the Son of God yet, but you must at least be a representative of God, kind of like Moses was, or Elijah or Elisha, other people who performed miracles in the Old Testament, because nobody would be able to do these supernatural things you're doing if God wasn't working through him, with him. So Nicodemus was allowing the signs to lead in the direction that they were intended to lead. Now, I want to think with you, though, about the fact that some deny miracles, even though I think the miracles were done openly. I think we can see that there are a lot of excuses made for, and a lot of false intentions for why the miracles were denied. But I want you to think a little bit about differentiating what a real miracle is and the language that sometimes people use for miracles. Because we use the word miracle way too loosely. For example, I like Miracle Whip better than mayonnaise, but it ain't a miracle, all right? Right? It's good, but it's not a miracle what they did there. It's a pretty natural set of ingredients that they put together there. And we use miracle in ways that aren't really biblically miracles. For example, have you seen the movie Miracle on Ice? Right, Miracle on Ice in 1980. The Miracle on Ice was certainly a rare event because the U.S. men's hockey team defeated the defending gold medalists, and that was a really big deal in 1980, but there's nothing miraculous about it. Underdogs sometimes win. It's a very natural thing. Two teams compete. One team wins. One team had a bad day, the other team had a good day, and the underdogs won the event. It's not a miracle. It makes a good movie, but it's not a miracle. The Miracle on the Hudson in 2009. Captain Chelsea Sullenberger landed his plane on the Hudson River, and amazingly, all 155 passengers lived. Now that's thrilling, but this guy was a fantastic pilot. He did what he was supposed to do in emergency situations, and he landed the plane in a very unique way in an emergency situation, and everybody lived. No natural laws were superseded there. No natural laws were superseded. It was a natural event. And so it's not a miracle in the sense of the biblical term miracle. Miracles are also not equivalent to medical progress. The wisdom and wonder of herbs and medicines and surgeries and therapies are certainly worthy of praise. I appreciate those who are involved in medicine and involved in trying to find cures to diseases and to problems and maladies. But it's not miraculous. God has given us certain things in this earth that are to be used so that we can help people and so that we can have better health. And when we use those things for our good, credit should be given to God that He has given us the natural resources to try to help our health and improve our health. It's not necessarily miraculous. And the scriptures make a distinction between medical intervention and the miraculous. Look at Matthew chapter 8 and verse 3. Look at a couple passages with me. Matthew chapter 8 and verse 3. In Matthew 8 and verse 3, it says this: Jesus put out his hand, touched him, saying, I am willing, be cleansed. Immediately his leprosy was cleansed. I think most people understand that if you were a leper, you can't just reach out and touch a leper and immediately the leprosy be gone. There's clearly something miraculous that has happened here. However, if he said, all right, you have leprosy, I know about this cream that you can put all over your body, and if you'll give it 7 days, your leprosy will begin to improve gradually. Well, that's medicine. That's what medicine does. There's a difference between a miracle, which happens instantaneously without any natural cures or any natural administration of medicines, and there's a difference between a miracle and medicine. Take a look at verse 13. Jesus says to the centurion, he's got a servant who is at home, who is feels like he's about to die, and he says, go your way, and as you have believed, so let it be done for you. And his servant was healed that same hour. There's clearly something miraculous that happens here. But if he had said, go home, give your servant a couple of Tylenol, give him a little bit of a drink, we're going to give him an IV, and by tomorrow he's going to be feeling better. Well, that's medicine. There's a difference between a miracle, which is instantaneous without the administration of medicine, and medicine. They're not the same thing. Miraculous healings are instantaneous, not progressive. Miracles are also not in the same category as magic. Magic is not a miracle. I think magic's really cool, fun to watch a good magic show, but miracles are under God's control. Magic is under man's control. Miracles are done at God's will and in His time. Magic is done at man's will and in His time. Miracles do not involve deception. Magic involves deception and sleight of hand and trickery. Miracles are for God's glory. Magic is for the magician's glory. Miracles were intended to confirm God's message when they were used. Like in Mark 16:20, when he talks about you could perform miracles and you will confirm the word with the signs following. That was the purpose of miracles. But magic is used to entertain. It's used to deceive. It's not in the same category. So we can't put those things in the same category. And let me also point out, this is important in the religious world, unfortunately, miracles were not for the purpose of making money. Not for the purpose of making money. Jesus never performed a miracle and then passed the hat around and passed the collection plate around. And if you go into churches and they're pretending to perform miracles and then passing around the collection plate and the money, I think I would just simply ask the question, where in the scriptures did you ever see Jesus or any of his apostles operating in that way? Using the miracles to try and make money off of people. No fee was levied when a miracle occurred. It was not a money-making gig. In fact, when Simon the sorcerer in Acts chapter 8 sees that the apostles, by laying on the apostles' hands, they could give miraculous power to others, he said, I want that power too. Probably one of the reasons why? Well, because Simon the sorcerer previously had made money off of trickery and deceit. And people assumed he was a great power of God. And he wanted to use the miracles for those same purposes. And he's rebuked by Peter for that. No fees levied. It's not a money-making gig. That wasn't the purpose of miracles. Kind of like this Benny Hinn thing over here on the right. You don't see faith healers working at hospitals for the same reason psychics don't win the lottery. It's fake. It's fake. There are false teachers. There are deceivers in the religious world. Many more distinctions could be made if we had a more thorough study, but I think these are a few of the basic fallacies that are often made when people misunderstand miracles that we need to take a moment to distinguish. All right, what's the purpose of the demonstration of miracles? Well, the demonstration of miracles were intended again, to convince us into who Jesus was. For example, in Scripture, you see miracles of nature. It proves that Jesus had power over nature, like when he turns water into wine. The one who put nature into existence in the first place shows his power over nature. when he stills the storm in Matthew chapter 8, the one who created the seas and the oceans and the winds, he shows that he has power over the oceans and the seas and the winds when he stills the storm. It's a miracle of nature. There are other miracles in Scripture. There are miracles of physical healings, like with the leper in Matthew chapter 8, where he's instantly cleansed. The healing of the nobleman's son in John chapter 4, he's healed from a distance. But there are also miracles of resurrection, not just the resurrection of Jesus, but as we've studied in our morning studies, the widow's son at Nain in Luke chapter 7 is raised from the dead. Jairus' daughter, raised from the dead. Later you'd find in John chapter 11, if we were studying John, Lazarus is dead, 4 days dead. He's raised from the dead. All of these things are proof that Jesus has the power of God. He has power over nature. He has power over the physical body. Makes sense, right? He created nature. He created the physical body. He even has power over death. Makes sense too. He's the one who gave us life, and the one who gave us life has power over death, and he can resurrect the dead, and he himself is resurrected. In fact, if you read through the Gospel of John, we started with this passage in John chapter 20. It says that these signs are written down so that you may believe that Jesus Christ is Son of God. These are the 7 signs of Jesus in the Gospel of John. The 7 signs of Jesus. Have you ever considered how each of these signs teaches something slightly different about the power of Jesus? John 2, the water changed to wine demonstrates that Jesus has power over matter. He also has power over the quality of that matter. Turning the water into wine at Cana of Galilee. In John chapter 4, he heals the nobleman's son, demonstrates Jesus' power over distance. Jesus doesn't need to be there physically and physically touch the nobleman's son for him to have the power to heal him. He heals him from a distance. He doesn't even go to the house. And he has power over physical infirmity. John 5, you have the healing of the lame man, demonstrating Jesus' power over, again, physical infirmity, but also over time. Doesn't matter if he's been lame for years and years. Jesus has power over how this man has gotten worse over the years. He has power over time. John 6, he feeds 5,000. Jesus has power over quantity. He takes 5 loaves and 2 fishes, and he feeds 5,000 people with it. John 6, again, the walking on water demonstrates Jesus' power over nature. There's a nature miracle. John 9, the healing of the blind man demonstrates his power over darkness. He can take one who was never seen, and he now sees the light. He has power over darkness. And in John 11, the raising of Lazarus demonstrates Jesus' power over death, and it sets up the resurrection for us. More signs were demonstrated. More could have been written. But how many more do we need to indicate what God had intended? And the simple thing that God intends is he wants us to know he's working in Jesus. Jesus wasn't just an ordinary man with an ordinary message. This was God's man, and he's bringing to us God's message. And that's the point of the miracles, to get us to see that there is demonstrable proof that Jesus is who he claims to be. And so because of the demonstration of miracles, because no one really denied the miracles, all they tried to do was discredit Jesus and his apostles. Because we have distinguished true Bible miracles from some of the fraudulent claims of miracles that we see in our world today, I want you to consider this last point, and that is that the miracles of Jesus require a decision. Require a decision. All of these miracles force us to make a decision. Nicodemus had to make a decision whether he would follow the evidence to its obvious conclusion or not. And one of the really neat things about Nicodemus is I think Nicodemus eventually openly made the right decision. Isn't it interesting when you read about Nicodemus? Let me just show you 2 verses. When Nicodemus first comes to Jesus, he comes to Jesus by night. Comes to Jesus in the dark. Kind of like Nicodemus doesn't want anybody to see that he's having this private conversation with Jesus. He's doing a little self-investigation on his own to see if whatever Jesus is claiming to be is legitimate or real or not. Jesus has a good conversation with him. The next time we see Nicodemus is in John chapter 19. after Jesus has performed more miracles, and after Jesus has died, and what you find in John chapter 19 and verse 39 is Nicodemus, who at first came to Jesus by night, he also came bringing a mixture of myrrh and aloes, about 100 pounds. Nicodemus helps anoint the body of Jesus at his death. I think the evidence that Nicodemus had seen, not just from his conversation, not just from the things preceding his conversation, that what he continued to see and continued to hear caused Nicodemus to make the right decision about Jesus. Jesus was not someone who deserved to be put on a cross. Jesus was someone who deserved to be honored and revered, and all Nicodemus could do when he died was show his honor and reverence by how he treated his body at death. He followed the evidence where it led. Now, the Pharisees who saw the blind man comes and explains to them why he now sees. They had to make a decision as to whether they would believe the evidence. And the blind man explains, here's the person who healed me. Here's what he did. Here's how quickly it happened. And the blind man is probably one of the most hilarious characters of the Bible. He's just like, why can't you figure out that if I was blind and now I see, that there's something pretty awesome about this guy? What's so hard about this? Why is this a hard decision to make? Why are you questioning so much? I mean, it's obvious. So the blind man who couldn't see is now trying to help the blind teachers who needed to see. And he tells them the evidence needs to be followed where it leads, that there's something special about Jesus. And then Thomas, he has to make a decision as to whether he would believe the evidence of Jesus' resurrection or if he would obstinately disbelieve. For a while there, he's obstinate about it. He says, unless I see the holes in his wrists, unless I see the hole in his side, unless I can actually touch it, then I'm not going to believe, because dead people don't rise. And so Jesus appears to him and says, if you want to go ahead and touch, you want to go ahead and see, I'm giving you the opportunity to examine the evidence, and I want you to take that evidence and I want you to follow it where it leads. And Thomas says, my Lord and my God. We must make a decision. Did the miracles happen? What do they prove? And what does that mean for us today with regards to our relationship with Jesus Christ? So I want you to put yourself in the shoes of Thomas as we close, and visualize the nail-pierced hands. Envision the sword-pierced side. Gaze into the eyes of Jesus and ask, will I confess my faith in the risen Savior, follow the evidence where it leads, or will I continue to deny him?